The in-dying patients had been flying for 16 days when the signal came through. It was not a loud signal. It was not urgent or dramatic. It came in quietly, almost shyly, like someone knocking on a door they were not sure anyone would answer. Sub-Commander Orith was in the middle of a routine scan report when his communications officer turned around in her seat and said, very carefully, that they were picking up a structured transmission from the surface of Fringe 7. Orith put down his report. Structured transmissions did not come from Fringe 7. Nothing came from Fringe 7. The planet had been marked in the collective database as a dead zone for over 40 years, one of dozens of outer fringe worlds that had been visited once, found to be hostile, and quietly forgotten. There were no Veil installations there. There was nothing, except apparently a signal. He walked to the communication station and listened to it himself. It was slow and repeating, a low pulse with a short coded sequence inside it. It was not Veil in origin. Orith recognized the structure after a moment, because the collective had filed reports on this kind of transmission before. Old human emergency beacon formatting, modified and extended, as if someone had taken the original distress signal and quietly converted it, over many years, into something more like a greeting. Tactical Analyst Soon was already pulling up the file on the planet before Orith asked him to. Fringe 7 had a formal designation that no one used. It was a mid-sized world, heavy gravity, dense atmosphere, 2 large continents divided by a shallow inland sea. The plant life was aggressive, the fauna were worse. The Veil Collective had done a single-pass survey of the planet roughly 60 years ago, and had classified it as a Category 3 hostile environment. Survivable in short term with proper equipment, dangerous in long term without it. The humans had landed there anyway. Not by choice, Soon explained. 44 years ago, a human colony transport called the Garrison Wake had suffered a critical drive failure while crossing the outer fringe. The ship had 912 people aboard, colonists bound for a registered human settlement 2 systems over. The drive failure took out their navigation and most of their propulsion. Fringe 7 was the closest body with enough atmosphere to attempt a landing. It was not a good option. It was simply the only option. They had gone down hard. A single distress signal had been recorded from the surface shortly after the crash. The humans had reported catastrophic ship damage, multiple casualties from the landing itself, and an immediate hostile fauna contact within the first 6 hours on the ground. Then the signal had stopped. The collective had logged the event, noted the location, and quietly assumed that the colonists had not survived longer than a few years. Fringe 7 was not the kind of world that gave second chances. That had been 44 years ago. Orith stood very still for a moment, looking at the data on Soon's screen. Then he gave the order to descend through the cloud layer and take a low approach over the signal's point of origin. The crew of the Undying Patients were experienced survey personnel. They had seen dead worlds and dying colonies and the long wreckage of civilizations that had tried and failed to hold on. They were not easily surprised. But as the ship dropped below the clouds and the surface of Fringe 7 came into view on the forward screens, the bridge went very quiet. It was not ruins. The colony was alive. Orith could see it clearly, even from altitude. A tight cluster of structures built in deliberate rings, surrounded by a thick outer wall that caught the light and held it. The wall was not made from any single material. It was layered and patched and reinforced over and over again, as if it had been built, damaged, rebuilt, and improved so many times that it had simply become something else entirely. Around the settlement, in every direction, the land had been cleared and shaped. Fields stretched out in long organized rows, clearly planted and tended. Water channels cut narrow lines through the earth, feeding into a central reservoir. There were lights, actual lights, steady and warm, coming from windows and doorways in the structures below. Soon ran the bioscan, without being asked. The results came back, and he read them twice before he said anything. There were over 1,000 human biosignatures on the surface. More than 1,200 in fact. Not 912 survivors from 44 years ago. More. They had not just survived. Somehow, impossibly, there were more of them now than there had been when they landed. The ship made a slow pass over the settlement. On the screens, Oreth watched the colony move below them. People were going about their work in the fields and the courtyard. A group of older children were carrying something between two buildings. Nobody ran. Nobody panicked. One small figure, a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, stopped in the middle of a courtyard, looked directly up at the ship passing overhead, and waved. It was such a simple gesture. Oreth found himself staring at it longer than he should have. He sent a diplomatic hail on the standard open frequency and identified the vessel. The response came back in less than 2 minutes, delivered in rough but functional veiled trade tongue that had clearly been translated by very old software. The voice was male, calm, and entirely unbothered. Hargrove Colony, Fringe 7. We've been expecting someone to show up eventually. You can land in the eastern field. There's enough flat ground for your size ship. Mind the markers on the way in. Those are graves, and we'd appreciate you not disturbing them. Oreth looked at Soon. Soon looked at Oreth. Then the communications officer pointed at something on the external camera feed and said quietly that they might want to see this. Soon pulled the camera feed to the main screen and zoomed toward the eastern perimeter of the settlement, beyond the wall, where the transmission had indicated they should land. There was a field there, as the human voice had said, but between the landing area and the outer wall, stretching back further than the camera could clearly show, was something else. Graves. Hundreds of them, in long, organized rows. Some of the markers were simple, flat stones, carved wood, pieces of metal. The human graves, those were easy to recognize. They were the smaller ones. It was the other markers that made the bridge go silent again. Some of them were enormous. One marker, visible even at this distance, appeared to be made from a skull, a single skull, mounted on a reinforced post as tall as a 2-story building. Soon zoomed the camera as far as it would go, and felt something cold move through him. He knew that skull. Every member of the Veil Collective who had ever studied frontier survey records knew that skull. It belonged to a creature that had ended 3 separate Veil colony attempts on 3 different worlds. A creature that appeared in collective safety briefings as an example of what a Category 3 hostile planet could produce. A creature that the Collective's own military had classified as a standing threat to any ground operation. And it was a grave marker. Someone had killed it and used its skull to mark a grave. Nobody on the bridge spoke. The ship moved slowly toward the eastern field, and below them, the colony waited, patient, warm, alive, and entirely unconcerned. The eastern field was wide and flat and smelled like turned earth and something faintly metallic. The undying patience touched down without difficulty, and for a long moment after the engines went quiet, nobody on board moved. Sub-Commander Oreth stood at the top of the landing ramp and looked out at the field, at the sky, at the thick dark tree line in the distance that pressed up against the edge of the cleared land like it was waiting for an invitation. Then he saw the man. Cole Hargrove was standing at the edge of the field, with his arms at his sides and a long rifle slung across his back. He was not hiding, and he was not posturing. He was simply standing there, the way a man stands at the edge of his own property. Comfortable, present, mildly curious. He looked to be in his late 60s. His face was weathered and deeply lined, the kind of face that came from decades of wind and sun and hard work. He was not a large man. He did not look like someone's idea of a frontier hero. He looked like someone's grandfather. Oreth descended the ramp with his delegation. Elder Delegate Koss, Tactical Analyst Soon, and 2 security escorts. They crossed the field slowly. Hargrove watched them come, and did not move until they were close enough to speak without raising their voices. Then he extended his hand. Oreth had read about human handshakes. He had never actually experienced one. He took the man's hand, and Hargrove shook it once, firmly, the way the reports described. A simple physical greeting, direct and brief. Soon, standing just behind Oreth, watched it happen, and felt something shift in his understanding of the situation, though he could not immediately say what it was. Hargrove said his name, and asked if they had found the field all right. Oreth said they had. Hargrove nodded, and told them to follow him. He walked them through the outer gate in the wall, without ceremony or explanation. The gate itself was a remarkable piece of engineering, heavy and reinforced, built from what appeared to be sections of the original colony ship's hull plating, welded and bolted together over what must have been many years of additions and repairs. The hinges were the size of a grown adult. The locking mechanism was a thick, manual bar, not electronic, not remote, something you operated with your hands and your body weight, something that would still work even if every power system in the colony went dark. Inside the wall, the colony opened up. It was not large by any standard Oreth was used to, but it was dense and deliberate, every space used with a kind of quiet intelligence. The innermost area of the settlement, the structures closest to the center, housed what Hargrove identified as the children's quarters, the medical room, and the food storage. The next ring out was where most of the colonists lived, in long, low buildings that had clearly been built and extended and repaired so many times that the original design was barely visible. The outermost ring, just inside the wall, was a mix of workshops, equipment storage, and what appeared to be watch positions built into the wall itself, at regular intervals. Soon noticed that the watch positions were not decorative. A young woman caught up with them about halfway through the tour. Her name was Paige Dunlap, and she was in her late 20s, born on this planet, carrying a battered engineering tablet under one arm, and wearing the particular expression of someone who has been awake since before dawn, and intends to stay awake until well after dark. She fell into step beside Hargrove as if she had been doing it her whole life, which, Soon supposed, she had. Paige started talking about the colony's power grid, without being asked, and without any apparent interest in whether the veiled delegation could follow along. She spoke quickly and with total confidence, referencing systems and adaptations and workarounds that made clear the colonists had not simply maintained the technology they had landed with. They had extended it, rebuilt it, and in several cases invented entirely new solutions when the original equipment failed and there were no replacement parts to be found. Elder Delegate Koss asked at one point how the colony generated power. Paige glanced at him sideways and said they used a combination of thermal extraction from the local geology, a set of modified turbines that ran off the wind that came down from the northern ridge every evening without fail, and what she called the old core, the colony ship's original power system, which had been reduced to about 12% of its original output over the decades, but was still running. She said this the way someone might mention an elderly relative who still insisted on doing their own cooking, with affection and a kind of quiet respect. Koss asked how many colonists had survived the original crash. Hargrove said they had landed with 912 people. Koss nodded slowly, already preparing something gentle to say about loss and endurance. Hargrove added that they had 1,340 people now. Koss stopped walking. Hargrove walked another 2 steps before he noticed and stopped as well, turning back with an expression of mild patience. Koss said carefully that he wanted to make sure he had understood correctly. The colony had more people now than when it arrived. Hargrove said that was correct, said children tended to have that effect on numbers, said it without any sarcasm, just as a plain observation. Soon did the arithmetic quietly in his head. 44 years, no resupply, no outside contact, a Category 3 hostile world, and they had not declined. By nearly 50%. They were taken next to a long, low building near the center of the colony that served as the archive and record hall. A woman named Nina Calloway met them at the door. She was perhaps 50 years old, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the unhurried manner of someone who spent most of their time with documents and found documents to be better company than most people. She was the colony's historian and record keeper, and the room behind her was proof that she had taken that job seriously. The walls were lined with shelving from floor to ceiling. The shelves held binders, bound books, handwritten journals, and metal-cased data units that looked like they had been repaired many times. Every year of the colony's existence was documented. Not just the big events, but the details. The names of people who had been born and the names of people who had died. The crops that had succeeded and the crops that had failed. The decisions the colony council had made and the reasons behind them. The things that had come out of the dark beyond the wall, and the things the colony had done about them. Koss stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly, taking it in. Soon drifted to the nearest shelf and looked at the spines of the binders. Each one was labeled by year. Year 1. Year 2. He pulled Year 1 from the shelf and opened it carefully. The first page was handwritten, the ink slightly faded, the handwriting quick and pressed hard into the paper. The handwriting of someone writing under pressure, someone writing because they needed to record what was happening before they forgot or before they couldn't. It began with the words, "We are down, ship is gone, we are alive." Soon read those 4 sentences 3 times. Then he closed the binder very gently and put it back exactly where he had found it. Nina watched him do this and said nothing. But when he looked up at her, she gave him a small nod, as if he had passed some kind of test he had not known he was taking. The next morning was cold and gray, with a low wind coming down from the northern ridge that pushed through the settlement in slow, steady waves. Cole Hargrove was waiting outside the guest quarters when Oreth and his delegation emerged just after dawn. He had a cup of something hot in one hand and his rifle on his back, same as the day before. He looked like he had been awake for hours, which Soon suspected was simply how Hargrove lived. Not early, not late, just always. Hargrove asked if they were ready to see the cemetery. Oreth said they were. Hargrove finished his drink, set the cup on a nearby ledge, and started walking east. He walked through the cemetery the way someone walks through a room they know so well they no longer have to look at where they are going. His pace was easy and unhurried. He did not perform anything. He did not explain things before they needed explaining. He simply walked, and the delegation followed, and the cemetery opened up around them, like something that had its own kind of gravity. The rows were long and organized. The ground was kept clear between them, the earth raked and maintained. The human graves were easy to find. Modest markers, flat stones or carved wood, or small metal plates, each one carrying a name, a birth year, a death year, and sometimes a single line of text. They were not dramatic. They were careful and clean and quietly dignified, the way people mark the graves of those they actually knew and actually loved. Soon walked slowly, reading the markers as he passed. A man who had lived to 67. A woman taken in year 3. 2 children side by side who had not made it through the first winter. He did not rush past them. They deserved the moment. But it was the other graves that were making it hard for him to breathe normally. The first one he recognized, he almost walked past it. Then his scanner gave a soft tone, and he stopped and looked at it properly. The marker was a length of bone mounted horizontally between 2 stone posts. A single bone, as long as a ground transport vehicle, pale and smooth and very old now, bleached by years of open air. Beneath it was a flat stone plaque, hand-carved, the letters deep and deliberate. It came out of the southern tree line on the 9th night. We lost 2 good people before we understood how it moved. After that, we didn't lose anyone else. Year 3. Soon ran the scan on the bone. The result came back, and he stared at it for a moment. Then he looked at Hargrove. Hargrove glanced at the scanner result and nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "That one." Soon knew that creature from collective records. It appeared in threat assessment briefings for Outer Fringe operations. It was fast, it was nearly silent, and it was intelligent enough to change its approach between attacks. A Veil patrol unit had encountered one on a survey mission 14 years ago. 3 of the unit's 6 members had not come home. The collective had issued a standing advisory after that. If evidence of this creature was found on a survey world, operations were to be suspended, and command was to be notified. The humans had killed one in Year 3, with 2 casualties, and then kept going. Hargrove was already walking further in. The delegation followed in silence now. Elder Delegate Koss had stopped asking questions. He was simply looking. Soon kept his scanner running, but he stopped announcing the results out loud, because there did not seem to be any point. The creatures kept coming, and the results kept being the same. Known, catalogued, classified as dangerous, sometimes classified as extremely dangerous. And the plaques kept telling the same kind of story in plain, simple words. They sent the small ones first, for 2 weeks. When we stopped reacting to the small ones, they sent something larger. We built a second wall section that season, Year 7. It walked on 6 legs, and it didn't make any sound at all. Derek's father tracked it for 11 days before he found where it slept. Year 14. We think there were 4 of them. We only ever found 3 bodies. Year 22. That last one made Suan stop walking entirely for a moment. We only ever found 3 bodies. He looked out at the tree line in the distance. The wind moved through it. Something moved in the dark between the trunks. Or maybe nothing did. He could not be certain. He kept walking. Near the back of the cemetery, the graves became larger. The ground cover thinned, and the markers grew taller, and the scale of what was buried there became harder to look at directly. A set of 6 massive clawed limbs had been arranged in an X shape over a wide mound, the claws as long as Suan's entire arm. A coiled body lay preserved and desiccated along one entire row, taking up the space of a dozen human graves, its scales still carrying a faint iridescent color even after years in the open air. Then they reached the wall of carapaces. Suan stood in front of it for a long time. It was not a grave marker in the traditional sense. It was a mosaic. Hundreds of individual shells pressed and fused together into a single surface. Each one roughly the size of a human torso, the whole thing stretching nearly 8 meters across and 4 meters high. The plaque at the base was the longest of any they had seen. They came every night for 4 months in the summer of Year 19. We stopped counting individual kills at 3,000. They always came from the east. We stopped sleeping in shifts and started sleeping in watches instead. Nobody gave up. When the last wave came, we were ready for it. We kept every shell, because we thought we should remember how many there were. Orith read the plaque and said nothing. Koss read it and looked at the wall for a very long time. At the very back of the cemetery, slightly separate from everything else, was the largest mound of all. It rose nearly 4 meters at its peak, and what sat atop it was a ribcage, a single ribcage, so large that a person could walk through it without ducking. The bones were dark, almost black, and enormous in a way that made everything around them feel briefly smaller. Hargrove stood beside the mound with his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing for a moment. Koss asked what it was. Hargrove said they had never found a name for it in any record they had. It had come from the deep ice shelf in the far north in year 28. It had come alone. It had come at night, during the worst winter the colony had ever experienced. It had hit the wall so hard the first time that 3 sections had come down immediately. The whole colony had fought it, every adult who could hold a weapon. They had fought it for 2 full days and 1 full night. When it was finally over, 6 people had died. Hargrove pointed to 6 small human grave markers, arranged in a careful row at the base of the mound, tucked just under the arch of the ribcage, sheltered by it the way a roof shelters a house. He said they had buried their people there, right at the feet of the thing that had made them fight that hard. Said it seemed right. Said those 6 people had earned their place next to something that large. Soon looked at those 6 small markers under that massive ribcage for a long time. 6 names, 6 sets of years, 6 single lines of text. Nobody said anything for a while. Then Soon noticed the section near the front of the cemetery that he had not paid attention to on the way in. A wide stretch of carefully prepared ground, fresh-turned earth, new grave markers still pale and unweathered, waiting. The section was empty, or mostly empty. There were a few new graves near the edge of it, recent ones, from the last few years. But most of the space was still open. He looked at Hargrove. Hargrove followed his gaze and understood immediately what he was looking at. "That section isn't full yet," Hargrove said simply. He did not say it as a warning or a boast. He said it the way a farmer talks about a field that still has growing seasons left in it, as a plain and practical fact about the future. The wind moved through the cemetery. Somewhere in the distance, past the wall, past the cleared land, the dark tree line shifted and settled. The delegation walked back to the settlement in silence, and none of them had anything to say that felt adequate. The colony's main hall was not a large building, but it was a warm one. The walls were thick and the ceiling was low, and the long wooden tables that filled the room had been used so many times they had developed a kind of smooth shine that no amount of deliberate polishing could have produced. It only came from years of hands and elbows and meals shared between people who had no choice but to trust each other completely. The colonists had invited the entire Vale delegation to eat with them that evening. Not just Oreth and Kos and Soon. All of them, every crew member of the Undying Patience who could be spared from the ship. It was the kind of invitation that came with the quiet assumption that of course you would come, that there was plenty of food, and that sitting apart from each other would simply be a waste of a good evening. The Vale crew filed in carefully and took seats at the tables, surrounded by colonists of every age. Children ran between chairs and were called back by parents. Someone brought out large flat loaves of bread and set them on every table without ceremony. The smell of cooked food filled the room completely, and Suin, who had eaten nothing but ship rations for 16 days, felt something in him relax that he had not realized was tense. The colonists were not awed by the Vale presence. They were curious, genuinely, openly curious, but not in the way that people are curious about something frightening. They asked questions the way people ask questions about travelers who have come from somewhere interesting. Where had they come from? What did other worlds look like? Were there many planets out there with trees? A child of about 10 years old sat down directly across from Suin and asked him, without any preamble, if his species had good eyesight or bad eyesight, because he looked like he might have good eyesight. Suin told her that Vale eyesight was considered above average by most standards. She nodded seriously and told him that was probably useful. He agreed that it was. After the meal, Aaron Voss found Oreth near the far end of the hall and asked if he wanted to step outside for a while. Voss was the head of the colony's defense corps, a man in his early 50s, broad across the shoulders, with a long scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, and a manner that was direct without being aggressive. He did not waste words, and he did not fill silence for the sake of it. They walked along the inside of the outer wall together, the night air cool and clear above them. Voss talked about the colony's defense history, the way someone talks about a long project they are still working on, with deep familiarity and without any need to impress. In year 1, he said, they had the ship's weapons, mounted cannons, directed energy units, a few portable systems the crew had managed to salvage during the landing. Those had worked well in the beginning. The problem was that they were built for space, not for a planet's surface, and they burned through their power reserves faster than expected. By year 5, most of the ship's weapons were gone, used up, broken down, or taken apart and converted into something else. So, they had built their own. Voss described the progression with the same calm patience he probably used when training new recruits. Crossbows first, made from materials the planet itself provided. Then converted tools, power equipment from the ship, adapted into firearms, rough and loud and unreliable, but functional. Then actual weapons, manufactured from metals they had smelted themselves from local ore, designed and tested and refined over years of hard experience. By year 20, they had a complete, functioning armory that owed almost nothing to the original ship. Orith asked what had driven the improvements. Voss looked at him steadily and said one word: learning. He said that everything on this planet was smart. Not human smart, not in the way that made them talk or plan the way people did, but smart in the way that living things got smart when their environment demanded it of them. They adapted. The creatures that came to the wall in year 1 were not the same as the creatures that came in year 10. The approaches changed, the timing changed, the sizes changed. The ones that kept coming were the ones that had survived contact with the colony before, and they had learned from it. So the colony had to learn faster. Orith thought about that for a long moment, and said nothing. Inside the hall, Elder Delegate Koss had found Nina Calloway at the back of the room, and they had been talking quietly for nearly an hour. Nina had brought out the colony's most important document, a handwritten booklet from year 2, small and worn, and held together now with 3 metal clips because the original binding had given out long ago. It had been written by the first Colony Council, a simple record of everything they had observed about the planet in their first year. What grew where, what the weather did in each season, which creatures came close and which ones kept their distance, and what the difference seemed to be. It was 14 pages in year 2. Nina said it was over 300 pages now. Every council since the first had added to it. Every generation had contributed something. It was the colony's real inheritance. Not the buildings or the wall or the weapons, but the knowledge. Everything they had learned, written down so that nobody who came after would have to learn it from scratch. Koss held it very carefully, and turned the pages slowly. The handwriting changed throughout. Different hands, different inks, different years. Some entries were long and detailed. Some were just a single line. One entry, from year 31, said only, "Do not go near the northern ice shelf alone. Ever." There was no further explanation. Koss looked up from the booklet and found himself trying to form a question that had been sitting with him since the cemetery. He turned it over for a moment, making sure he had the words right, and then he asked it. He asked if the colony had ever lost hope. Not in the difficult years, not in specific hard moments, but truly, had there ever been a time when the people here had looked at this world and at their situation, and had considered the possibility that they simply could not survive it, that they might be better off stopping. The room had quieted around them without either of them noticing, and several colonists nearby had turned slightly toward the conversation. Nina looked at Koss with an expression that was not unkind, but was very direct. Before she could answer, Cole Hargrove's voice came from further down the table. He had not been part of the conversation. He had been eating quietly, and apparently not listening. But he set down his fork, and looked across at Kos with the same expression he had worn when he met them in the eastern field. Calm, present, mildly curious about what had prompted the question. He asked Kos what surrender would have meant. Surrender to what? Kos said he meant surrender to the planet, to the idea that the colony could not survive here, to the possibility that staying was costing more than it was worth. Hargrove looked at him for a long moment, not with anger, not with pride, with the quiet patience of someone considering whether the question made sense from the inside. Then he said, "We had children here." He picked up his fork again. He said it simply, as if that was the only answer the question had ever had. As if the existence of children in a place made the question of leaving or stopping not just wrong, but somehow beside the point. A question that belonged to a different kind of situation entirely, one that had no connection to where they actually were. The room was quiet for a moment. Derek Wayne, sitting 3 seats down from Hargrove, an old, gruff man with a tracker's habit of watching everything in a room at once, nodded once, without looking up from his plate. He did not add anything. He did not need to. Suin sat very still and thought about what Hargrove had just said. The simplicity of it, the total absence of drama in it. No speech about courage or endurance or the human spirit. Just a plain statement about children and what their presence meant to the people responsible for them. He looked around the room, at the children still running between chairs, at the parents calling them back, at the old men and women who had been born here and had never seen any other sky. And he understood, in a way he had not quite understood before, that this colony had never been a survival story. It had always been a home. On the 3rd morning, Elder Delegate Kos sat alone in his quarters aboard the Undying Patience and tried to write his report. This was not normally a difficult task for him. Kos had written hundreds of colonial assessment reports over the course of his career. He had a format he trusted and a vocabulary he knew well, and a way of organizing observations that his superiors had always found clear and useful. He was good at his job. He had always been good at his job. He stared at the blank document on his screen for a long time. The Vale Collective had a standard protocol for situations like this one, for the discovery of an unregistered colony operating in unclaimed fringe space. There was a form for it. There were boxes to fill in: population count, infrastructure assessment, resource evaluation, security classification, integration recommendation. It was a tidy process designed to take something complicated and reduce it to something manageable, something that could be passed up the chain of command and filed and acted upon without anyone further up having to spend too much time thinking about it. Kos opened the form. He read the first field. He closed the form again. He opened a blank document instead and sat there. He thought about the cemetery. He thought about the plaques and what was written on them. The plain, unhurried language of people, recording facts they considered important. Not boasting, not performing, just writing down what had happened, the way you write down something you do not want to forget. He thought about the rib cage at the back of the cemetery, the one so large you could walk through it, and the 6 small graves sheltered underneath it. He thought about the booklet Nina had shown him. 300 pages of accumulated knowledge passed from one generation to the next like something precious, which it was. He thought about what Hargrove had said at the dinner table. The simplicity of it. We had children here. 4 words that had apparently contained, for these people, everything that needed to be said on the subject. The collective's original assessment of the human species had been written over 200 years ago by a survey team that had spent 11 days in orbit above one of the human homeworld's neighboring colonies and had filed their observations from a comfortable distance. The report had described humans as a moderately capable, mid-tier species, ambitious in their expansion, innovative under pressure, but ultimately fragile, and best suited for managed integration into the broader collective framework. It had been a reasonable report, based on what the survey team had observed. Koss had read it many times over the years, and had never questioned it. He was questioning it now. He began to type. He scratched out the first attempt after 4 sentences. He tried again, and scratched out the second attempt after 2. On the 3rd attempt he stopped trying to write in the language of assessment reports, and simply wrote what he thought was true. He wrote that the colony at Fringe 7 did not require an assessment. It required documentation. He wrote that the collective's existing classification of this species should be reviewed by anyone willing to spend 3 days on the surface of this planet and walk through the cemetery on the eastern perimeter. He wrote that what he had seen here was not survival. Survival was what you called it when something barely managed to persist. What he had seen here was something else. Something he did not have a clean word for in his own language. Something closer to what the humans themselves seemed to take entirely for granted. He saved the document, and closed his screen, and went to find Orith. They gathered the full crew of the undying patients together, and brought them down to the surface one last time, at the colony's quiet invitation. It had been Page's idea, passed through Hargrove, passed to Orith. A simple suggestion that before they left, the whole crew should walk through the cemetery with Nina as their guide. Not the delegation, not the officers, everyone. And so they went. Nina walked them through the rows slowly, the way she had clearly done many times before, and she told the stories the same way she always told them, without drama, without decoration, as simple history. She knew every marker. She knew the year and the circumstances, and in many cases the names of the specific people who had been involved. She talked about year 3, and year 7, and year 14, and the long, terrible summer of year 19, as if they were chapters in a book she had read so many times she could recite it from memory, which she could. The Vale crew listened. They did not talk much. Some of them crouched down to read the smaller plaques. Some of them stood for a long time in front of the larger markers. A few of them, soon noticed, stood in front of the human graves and were quiet in the way people are quiet when they are thinking about something they cannot fully put into words. Soon himself stopped near the front of the cemetery, in the newer section, in front of a grave that he had noticed on the first day but had not spent time with. It was a young man's grave. The dates said he had been 22 years old when he died, 4 years ago, in what the colony counted as year 41. The plaque was short. He held the east wall alone, for 6 hours. He bought the rest of us time. There was nothing else, no description of what he had been holding the wall against, no account of how he had managed 6 hours by himself, or what it had cost him. Just that one fact, stated plainly, and the understanding that the people who had carved it knew that anyone who read it would understand what 6 hours alone at the wall meant on this world. Soon stood there for a while and thought about a 22-year-old who had been born on this planet and had never seen any other sky, and had spent 6 hours alone in the dark so that the people behind him could have more time. He did not know what to do with that feeling. He suspected he would be carrying it for a long time. At the edge of the landing field, as the Vale crew made their way back toward the ship, Cole Hargrove appeared beside Orith and held out something. It was a small bound booklet, neatly copied, the pages fresh and clean. Page had printed it through the night. A full reproduction of Nina's 300-page record. Everything the colony knew about surviving on this world. Every season, every creature, every lesson learned the hard way over 44 years. Hargrove said, "In case it's useful." Orith took it with both hands. In Vale culture, receiving something with both hands was not a casual gesture. It was what you did when what you were being given had real value, when you wanted the other person to know that you understood what they were offering. Hargrove did not know this. It did not matter. Orith held the booklet carefully, and told Hargrove that they were grateful. Hargrove nodded once and said to have a safe trip. Soon stood at the observation window and watched the colony fall away below them. The rings of the settlement, the fields, the thick wall with its patched and layered surface, and beyond the eastern side, the long dark rows of the cemetery stretching out in the pale morning light. From above, the cemetery was larger than the colony. He had noticed this on the first day, and had not known what to make of it. He thought he understood it better now. The cemetery was not separate from the colony. It was part of it, the part that recorded every time something had come out of the dark and tried to end this place and failed. The part that said, in the plainest possible language, that this colony had faced hundreds of things that should have been the end of it, and had simply kept going. The colony shrank below them as the ship climbed. The tree line pressed in close around the cleared land from every direction. The world below was still dark in the places the colony's lights did not reach. But the lights were on. The last image soon saw before the clouds took everything was two small figures standing at the eastern wall in the early morning gray. One leaning on a rifle, one with an engineering tablet tucked under her arm. Both of them looking out at the tree line the way people look at something they have looked at every day, for as long as they can remember. Not afraid, just watching.